So let's begin.
Yes, sir.
Okay. At the outset, let me thank Dr. Manglani, Dr. Bhatt, the PHO chapter for having given me this opportunity. We were supposed to also have a student, but unfortunately, we are without a student at present. So anybody interested can contact me. We'll be discussing in two parts. The initial part will be looking at febrile neutropenia, and in the second part, we'll have a group of experts discussing antifungal therapy in children. So let's begin. I'll just share my screen.
चाय बन गई है। पढ़ाई क्या चाय बन गई है।
Okay, so Ria, will you let me know if I'm exceeding my time for this? I think I have about 25-30 minutes.
Sure,
So
sir.
will you just give me a intimation?
Yes, sir. Sure, I'll do that.
Okay. I'm going to talk about febrile neutropenia, which is actually a very common problem that we face in managing children with cancer. It's a major cause of morbidity and a risk of mortality for our patients. Much of what I'm going to talk about is based on the COG 2017 guidelines, but I have tweaked a lot of the points to try to make it simple and practical for students and for day-to-day management. As I said, it's one of the major causes of morbidity and mortality. It is the most important oncological emergency that we have, and especially even if the patient appears well, our emergency teams are instructed to treat them on par with any other pediatric emergency, or even more than that. Even if a patient comes convulsing, how effectively they'll handle that patient. The same level of urgency is necessary for handling febrile neutropenia. The risk of infection in cancer is multifactorial. Neutropenia, either because of marrow involvement or because of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, would predispose to bacterial and fungal organisms. It's important to know the kind of immunosuppression factors in a particular patient, because that is going to help us identify what are the likely organisms that we would be facing. T-cell abnormalities can occur because of leukemias, lymphomas, steroids, and they would predispose to fungi, viruses, Pneumocystis carinii, and so on. Very importantly, we have our natural barriers which act as a protection against infection. An intact skin and mucosa is a good protection against infection. But because of chemotherapy, there is mucositis, there are tiny ulcers which can be created across the intestinal tract. This causes a break in the barriers. Multiple invasive procedures that we do, and especially even simple things like an IV access can break the barrier. And these can, in addition, contribute to the infection, and predominantly nosocomial infection. We should not forget malnutrition, which is also a factor in our patients and which will contribute to a non-specific risk of infection. So just in brief, the definition. It is to be remembered that these definitions are made predominantly for a clinical trial or for a study, and in practice there could be some variations. We generally follow a fever of a single episode of more than 38, that is 100.4, or 2 episodes of 100 separated 1 to 2 hours apart. Neutrophil counts less than 500. Or less than 1000, but likely to decrease to less than 500 in the next day or two. As we see, fever in these patients may be muted because the neutrophil-mediated inflammatory response can be low, and fever may be the only sign. There may be no pus, there may be no other focus, just because the neutrophil count is low. At the same time, serious infection can occur without the occurrence of fever. So you just can't use fever as the only sign. So whenever we are looking at febrile neutropenia, we would need to expand the definition clinically. Patients on steroids, patients of stem cell transplantation sometimes will not have fever, but would just manifest with a general decrease in the performance status, with increasing tachycardia, and so on. And so these patients would definitely need to be treated and evaluated just like any other febrile neutropenia. One should look at the axillary temperature or the oral temperature with corresponding modifications. But it should be remembered that the rectal temperature measurement should be avoided because that can cause injury to the rectal mucosa and can cause a portal of entry for organisms. Similarly, neutropenia is not the only factor. We've seen so many other factors which cause immunosuppression. So whenever we have a patient of febrile neutropenia, the overall risk of infection is going to be related to not just the neutropenia, but to other components of the immunodeficiency also. And they also have to be considered in deciding what kind of organism, what is the risk of infection, and how long we need to treat, and so on. Secondly, and most importantly, the risk is not just dependent on the absolute neutrophil count, but it more depends on what is the status of the bone marrow at that time point. To give you an example, let's say you have a patient of AML, post chemotherapy day 3, the patient develops a fever, and you find a WBC count of 2000 with neutrophils of 98% and a platelet count of say 40,000-50,000. You can't say, okay, oh, this child is non-neutropenic, it's going to be fine. Because by this time, the marrow probably has been empty, and in a day or so, the neutrophil count is going to crash. So you have to look at any time, whenever you're evaluating a particular neutrophil count and deciding whether this patient is likely to be at risk for infection or not, one should look at what the treatment the child has received and what is the status of the marrow likely. On the other hand, we've seen patients with neutrophil counts of very low, say 50, 100, and suddenly they rise to even 200, and there is a dramatic change in the clinical status. So even though the neutrophil count may be very low, a recovering marrow is going to make things very easy for us. Other thing is, longer the duration of neutropenia, more will be the risk, more will be the chances of severe infections, fungal infections, and so on. We are able to identify an infectious source in about 20 to 30% of the patients, bacteremia in about 10 to 25. Our own experience is about 15 to 20%. This could probably be improved with using double or multiple cultures rather than single culture. The most important thing is to understand is that 80% of the infections will occur due to endogenous flora. That means the organism is already there in the patient's body at the time of infection and is not acquired newly. This has significant implications because we have seen very often that patients are isolated when they become neutropenic. And I really cannot find any rationale for this practice. It is the patients who are likely to develop neutropenia in future should have the same kind of infection prevention measures, whether they are neutropenic or not. Because they are going to likely to be colonized with infection, with hospital-acquired infection, with multi-drug resistant organisms, and even when they are non-neutropenic. And then once they're neutropenic, they would probably manifest that organism. When we didn't know, or in the previous maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't realize the significance of febrile neutropenia and a prompt starting of antibiotics. Mortality up to 70 to 80% was seen in patients who are not treated with antibiotics. So it's a real risk factor for mortality, and with effective therapy and prompt therapy, we can really bring it down. The kind of organisms seen in developed countries, they are reporting more of gram-positive versus more than gram-negative organisms. However, in our clinical practice, gram-negative organisms predominate. We are now increasingly grappling with more and more drug-resistant bugs. Overall, anaerobic infections are infrequent as a cause of bacteremia, but local infections in the form of perirectal infections, intra-abdominal infections, gingivitis, anaerobic infections need to be suspected. Fungal infections are rarely the cause of initial fever, but they are more often detected either in the evaluation of persistent fever or recurrent fever. Viral infections are common, and we are seeing a lot of CMV in our patient populations. And we really don't know much about the other viruses because we really don't have access to viral tests that often. So clinically, we could have three scenarios in febrile neutropenia. One is this febrile neutropenia with a clearly microbiologically documented infection. In other cases, there may be infection with just a clinical focus, which is giving us clues as to the likely organism and likely line of management. But in a majority of patients, we do not have any focus of infection, and we do not have any culture positivity to guide us. So the initial assessment needs to focus on some of these parameters, which we will just see one by one. Why do we need to risk assess? What is risk assessment? We just want to know whether the patient is at high risk or low risk for developing complications and for developing risk of mortality. So this will help us in deciding what would be the empiric antibiotic therapy, whether we need to hospitalize the patient or not, whether in future we are going to need some form of antifungal therapy, and how long we need to continue this therapy. Everything is going to be decided based on this risk assessment. Now, there are many pediatric risk stratification strategies, and there are many more than what is shown here. Unfortunately, there is no uniformly accepted policy consensus, and various patient disease and episode related factors are considered in deciding whether the patient is low or high risk. Some of the important ones which are commonly used is the presence of these are the high risk features, prolonged neutropenia, which is anticipated to last for more than 7 days from the time point of fever, uncontrolled malignancy, with especially relapse disease, active leukemia. Poor performance status also is a risk factor, is an indicator that the patient could be harboring a serious infection or would land up with a serious infection. Some other factors which may have been used is the presence of severe neutropenia and the presence of a monocyte count which is less than 100. As far as the clinical assessment, when the patient comes to you, of course looks at the vitals, when she looks at the performance status. One would look at the focus of infection. A detailed assessment is necessary. Look at the oral cavity, look at the lungs, look at the abdomen. And it's also important to sometimes ask for any perianal pain, because that is something which is the patients may not volunteer upfront. And a perianal focus can sometimes and can be a very serious kind of focus where one would treat this like a high risk patient. Lab investigations, routine hemogram and biochemistry. In addition, we look at the cultures. Now, the recommendation is to do cultures from all the catheter lumens. If you have a multi-lumen catheter, at least 2 cultures are recommended, one from the blood, one from the catheter, and if possible, one from the periphery. Peripheral cultures have been shown to increase the identification of bacteremia by about 12% when central cultures are negative. So the incremental value is there, and peripheral cultures do help in identifying the organism, but there is a risk of pain. There's a problem of venous access sometimes to obtain the culture, and there's also a risk of growing a contaminant rather than a true infection. The recommendation for urine culture is weak. It has been our general policy to do a urine culture in patients who have been symptomatic or those who show some abnormalities on urine analysis. But this has been shown now that this may not be a correct strategy, and most cases who have positive are either asymptomatic or do not have pyuria. So what is to be done about urine culture? The recommendation is weak, they do say, but how much will this contribute to clinical management is not yet known. What about imaging? Initially, there was a recommendation that all patients febrile neutropenia should undergo a chest X-ray. But over a period of time, we realized that routine X-rays are not really useful. We rarely pick up anything abnormal. And those asymptomatic patients who do not have X-rays and did not have any adverse outcomes. So X-rays should only be done, for that matter, other investigation like scan, in patients who have symptoms, either tachypnea or Krebs or some other form of lower respiratory tract infection. So what do we do about the initial treatment? Here we decide first whether the patient is high risk or low risk. High risk patients are generally recommended to be admitted. In our experience, we have found that we can manage a subset of these patients on OPD basis. About 20% of our high risk patients have been managed completely on OPD basis, and another 20% were managed partly on OPD basis. So appropriately selected patients, one can use OPD management. There are two types of antibiotic policies that one uses, either the escalation or the de-escalation policy. The de-escalation strategy uses multiple antibiotics upfront using a double gram-negative cover with the glycopeptide, and de-escalate if the patient becomes febrile after 40 to 72 hours and the cultures are negative. So you take off the second gram-negative cover and maybe even the glycopeptide. This approach is useful if there is a very high incidence of resistance and you're not, or if the patient is unstable and you really don't have time to decide. A drawback of this approach would be in patients who really don't have a bacterial infection and who do not become febrile after 40 to 70 hours because there's a viral infection or CMP or whatever. And unfortunately, these patients would then probably go on continuing receiving a large amount of antibiotics for a long period of time. On the other hand, the escalation strategy, which is more appropriate for a clinically stable patient, one would start off with either a monotherapy or a simple monotherapy and then escalate depending on what happens over the next few days. So it's important that antibiotics are started immediately after collection of samples, right in the ER itself. The recommendations are to start antibiotics within 30 to 60 minutes from the time the patient reaches the ER. The initial antibiotics should have gram-negative coverage because gram-negative infections can be quite fulminant, can be serious if, as you know, the doubling time of E. coli is about 20 minutes. So you realize that if rapid and early gram-negative coverage is not instituted, you could land up with a huge infection burden. The choice of antibiotics, what you say is empiric antibiotics, because we really don't know what the organism is. That will depend on what is the retrospective culture data from the institute. So local epidemiological factors play an important role in deciding what your choice of antibiotics is going to be. So what works in one institute may not necessarily work in another institute. And each institute will need to really get down and sit with the microbiologist and your infection control team and decide your protocol. COG recommends monotherapy with either an anti-pseudomonal beta-lactam, carbapenem, and they recently also added a 4th generation cephalosporin to this list. This monotherapy, or rather a second agent, should be added if there is hemodynamic instability or if there is suspicion or a high incidence of registered organisms. Glycopeptide therapy is added at the outset if there is a catheter-related infection, especially if a tunnel infection, there is cellulitis, there is evidence of pneumonia, intra-abdominal infections, perianal infections, hemodynamic instability, and of course, if the patient has a positive blood culture. On the contrary, low-risk patients can have a different approach. Most low-risk patients can be managed on an OPD basis, and we have a choice between oral and parenteral antibiotics. And just excuse me for a minute. Sorry. So there have been multiple studies for the use of oral antibiotics, but I'm personally not very convinced about the use of oral antibiotics even in low-risk patients. It can be used in patients with very low risk of neutropenia, solid tumor patients, which is well-controlled disease, low-intensity chemotherapy, 8 to 10 days post-chemotherapy, and so on. So we generally prefer to use parenteral antibiotics even for low-risk patients, except in the situations that I've just highlighted. So what do we do for the ongoing treatment? You have started antibiotics empirically. The fever response, the cultures are negative. So if you have started with monotherapy, obviously you would continue. But if you have added multiple agents, you could de-escalate if feasible. What do you do with persistent fever? Now, there has been a trend to upgrade antibiotics even for persistent fever, but COG recommends that those with persistent fever who are clinically stable may continue the same antibiotics started at baseline. In this situation, I think one would need to have a very, very close watch on these patients clinically and laboratory to look for clinical deterioration, look for any new focus which could dictate change in antibiotics, and probably look at more cultures to be able to assess whether we can identify the organism. What do you do if patient has persistent fever and has clinical deterioration? The obvious choice is to add or escalate antibiotics, either change or add antibiotics. One needs to aggressively follow a policy to identify organisms. So repeat cultures, imaging studies could play a major role here. Look at addition fungal infections as well as other foci of infection. Growth factors, generally we recommend in high-risk patients to be started prophylactically. So most of our patients who have high-risk neutropenia are probably already on growth factors, but if they are not, we would definitely try to use them, though their efficacy starting after onset of neutropenia is not as good as when started in the prophylactic setting. And lastly, granulocyte transfusions may be considered in select situations with resistant antibiotic-resistant organisms, with poor general condition. Definitely granulocyte transfusions is an option which can be explored. So how long do we continue therapy? Either based on risk status, whether the fever is there or not, evidence of marrow recovery, and culture result. This is the COG recommendation. They recommended in all patients discontinue empiric antibiotics in patients who have negative blood cultures at 48 hours, who have been afebrile for at least 24 hours, and who have evidence of marrow recovery. Now, there is no clear definition of what constitutes marrow recovery. Is it rise of the count over 500, or is it just a progressive increase in count? Similarly, in patients with low-risk febrile neutropenia, they have recommended discontinuation of empiric antibiotics at 72 hours in patients who have negative blood cultures and who have been afebrile for at least 24 hours, irrespective of the marrow recovery status. They have not commented, or there is no recommendation for high-risk patients without recovery of counts. Our policy is in the presence of recovering marrow, we wait for the patient to be for febrile for at least 48 hours with either minimum 5 days of antibiotics or till the ANC is crossed 500, whichever is earlier. In patients where marrow recovery is not evident in the form of increasing counts, treatment would be continued for a minimum of 7 days, with the patient remaining febrile for 5 days. And subsequently, these patients will also require a very close follow-up to decide whether, or to look at whether they develop a recurrence of fever. Antifungal, I won't go into the detail here. We'll be discussing this subsequently. So this role of imaging and the management of role of biomarkers and all, we'll discuss in the subsequent panel discussion. The discussion on febrile neutropenia cannot really be completed without a word on typhlitis. It's probably one of the most serious manifestations with focal infection or with evidence of focal localization in patients with febrile neutropenia. These patients are usually severely neutropenic, mostly AML patients. They develop mucositis following chemotherapy, and this allows for migration of the colonic flora across the intestinal wall, predominantly infecting the cecum, but it can also involve the entire colon. Infections are generally with gram-negative organisms, and anaerobes can definitely play a significant role. These patients present with either right iliac fossa or whole abdominal pain and tenderness, which may be accompanied by fever, diarrhea, and hypotension. They have a propensity of a rapid deterioration and can collapse and die within a matter of a few hours or a day if the problem is missed. So whenever we suspect the presence of typhlitis or necrotizing enterocolitis, one needs to promptly start antibiotics. A CT abdomen would be useful to assess these patients and would clinch the diagnosis. But one needs a very high index of suspicion for such patients. Surgery may be indicated in some of these patients. Perforation is an absolute indication. One would need to do it. Uncontrolled sepsis has been mentioned as a surgical indication, but it's extremely difficult to convince a surgeon to open up such a patient with hypotension, with coagulopathy, with thrombocytopenia, with very low counts. So we have not had much success in convincing surgeons to open up at this stage, and we do not really know what the outcome would have been if the patient would have undergone a surgery at that time. Growth factors, as I said, we would use prophylactically in high-risk patient episodes. So those patients at high risk of febrile neutropenia, recommended more than 40% risk of febrile neutropenia, prophylactic growth factors is recommended. I believe now that even 20% can be as a cutoff. Growth factors, however, are not very useful during febrile neutropenia, during leukemia induction. It has been shown that though they shorten the duration of neutropenia, they decrease the risk of decrease the duration of hospitalization. The overall mortality is not affected. So we generally don't use growth factors for febrile neutropenia during induction, but in special situations that like a patient having a serious resistant infection, severe sepsis, one could consider using growth factors. So and recovery of counts even a day or two in advance would be dramatically beneficial for such patients. We've seen that febrile neutropenia can be associated with a very significant morbidity and mortality, and every effort has to be made to prevent the occurrence of febrile neutropenia. Strategies could be to prevent neutropenia itself with the use of growth factors, to prevent colonization and infection with isolation, hand washing. Staff training is very important because they are the ones who already handle the venous access devices, the procedures, the blood sampling, and meticulous care is necessary. Isolation, not just, I mean, it could be one need not necessarily have a HEPA filtered room or something like that, but It is a barrier nursing which is necessary. Patients, not just who are at risk for infection, but those patients with resistant or serious organisms also need to be isolated from the rest so that an infection transmission in the wards is prevented. Prophylaxis, there is upcoming data on the use of prophylaxis, antibacterial prophylaxis in children. There are recommendations for using it in AML. Levofloxacin has been shown to be effective, but there is always an underlying worry that use of prophylaxis may contribute to development of antibiotic resistance, and hence we personally are not using much of prophylaxis. I don't know, I mean, maybe the others could contribute and tell whether they are also using it or not. There are certain unresolved issues which we would need to solve, address in the future. What is the impact of viral infections? We're seeing a lot of CMV in our patients, causing prolonged cytopenias, causing fever of unknown origin. And what should be the strategy for evaluation of viral infections during febrile neutropenia is not clearly defined. Secondly, how frequently and when are we going to do repeated blood cultures in patients of a persistent fever? Is something which is not available in the recommendations. Our policy is to do a blood culture either at the time of a clinical deterioration or at any time we feel that the patient requires a change in antibiotics. And lastly, the duration of antibiotics when no marrow recovery is evident. This our policy we've already discussed. Thank you very much. Back to you, Ria.
Sir, I think there are some questions in the chat box, and if you'd like to continue with the case, that's fine. Or if the experts would like to give some feedback or something, that's.
What should we do? I mean, and because 1 minute, I'll have to stop my screen sharing first, right?
Sure, sir.
Before I.
Yes.
Yeah. So fine. So before I reach the chat box.
So there's a question saying role of CRE screening in the stool for the febrile neutropenic patients. What is the role?
We personally don't do any screening as such on the stool. Maybe Amita and Ramandeep would like to say something about this.
If I may, Raman, or would you like to go first? So I agree with you about CRE. That is dependent. I think it is. No one has shown whether it's really efficacious doing screening. And as far as I understand, it's recommended only in place patients who, in situations where there's a very, very high MDR or a patient has previously been admitted with MDR. Otherwise, there's no hard evidence to show that this is going to help. And while you're speaking, I'll just add on to what Shailesh had already said. He's covered everything in a short time because febrile neutropenia is a huge topic. I just want to add that please be very because our audience is young people who are just embarking into their career, most of them, that there are some, stalwarts sitting here, but this is not for them. So growth factors is actually given to shorten your duration of neutropenia and is most useful when you're using reasonably medium to high dose chemotherapy in solid tumors. Once a patient has febrile neutropenia, growth factor isn't really going to help you, especially if you have clear-cut sepsis. And that's proven in multiple Cochrane reviews. And the other reason is that in liquid malignancies, like hematolymphoid malignancies, actually most people would recommend against using it for the simple theoretical risk of stimulating the clone. So that's one thing I wanted to add on. And granulocytes transfusion, Shailesh has already elaborated on it. I just want to add that, this is not an easy procedure to do, that you should all be aware of, because you should not go home with the thought that we can give granulocyte transfusion. It's not easy to get, and they have to be given literally every alternate day for efficacy for a few days, and that obviously may not be feasible depending on where you are. It might be possible in large institutions. It may not be easily feasible in every small place. Thank you.
Ramandeep, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so no, I think Amita has made excellent points, which are very pertinent. I wanted to add that I know Tata has done a lot of work on screening of stool samples, rectal swabs, and identifying the organism and the sensitivity. I am not up to speed with what is the impact of that been. Our challenge is that we clearly have a problem, and so we have to find innovative solutions to deal with the problem with the high mortality and the high resistance. So this may be one way of doing it. We personally in our hospital are not doing it routinely. So my experience is limited, but it has been explored in India, but in Tata, and also in the West in certain settings like transplant patients, etc., or ICU patients. It is being done. So there's a basis for it, but I cannot, I don't have more information to share on that.
So I can add on to that. Even we had done it, and it was not found to be really particularly, let's put it this way, significantly useful. So and plus, and studies across have shown that eventually it just adds on to your cost and not so much for efficacy. That's what I've understood from the whole thing. So I'm saying this so that I don't want the younger students to go back with the message that CRE is important. I think I just want to reiterate what Shailesh has said. The most important thing is that when a child comes in with FN, you have to concentrate on being able to administer antibiotics as soon as possible. That is one thing you have to remember. You don't wait, and I want to add that especially if a patient comes at night, no patient is going to come at night unless the parents think that the child is not serious enough. And number two, when a patient comes with shock, at that point of time, you do not go in for an hemodynamic compromise. At that point of time, you do not think of going the escalating way of antibiotics. At that point of time, you hit out, right? Depending on what your institutional flora is and what the policy is, you would start with a combination which will cover a multi-drug resistant organism if a child comes in hemodynamic compromise, and subsequently, depending on the culture or the patient's condition, you can de-escalate. That is a time when you definitely have to use a de-escalation strategy. The rest, again, it is dependent on institute to institute what sort of a antibiotic policy one follows. Thank you.
Dr. Sailesh, there's, I think, another question in the chat box if you're okay to take it.
I think I'll have to elaborate. I haven't understood what a blood carba R is, Dr. Revati. Dr. Maybe Shailesh knows it. And Dr. Narendra has also said in diarrhea, do you use probiotics? No one will recommend probiotics in a malignancy patient with any infection. We would not.
Dr. Sailesh, are you still online? We can't hear you, sir.
How about now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, you can, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So should we proceed now for the
Yes.
panel discussion?
Sure, sir.
Because that also is going to be a long one. So, sorry.
So while Shailesh is getting on to the next slide, there is a question about routine changing of first-line antibiotics. Yes, these decisions will be according to the flora of your institute, and one should always, every 1 year or whatever your depending on your institute, you should check the resistant organisms, etc., with your microbiology department, and you should change your first-line antibiotics depending on the sensitivity. And I think everyone should do that, and obviously that will be in discussion with your the microbiology department of your hospital.
So we'll begin this panel discussion. Dr. Parikshit Prayag, who was our transplant infectious disease consultant at Dinana, unfortunately cannot attend because of he's just recovering from COVID. So we really appreciate Dr. Jatin Ahuja to pitch in at a very short notice. You're welcome, Dr. Ahuja. Welcome, Dr. Trihan and Dr. Ramandeep. So antifungal or fungal infections in children with cancer also is an important cause of morbidity and mortality. We are, I believe, short of time. Ria, we have to wind up by 5:30. Is that so?
Yes, sir. By 5:30, 5:40.
5:30. So, okay, so we'll just directly move on to the first question before we go on to the cases. Amita, could you just highlight what would be the risk factors for fungal infections in pediatric cancer patients?
Yeah, Shailesh, thank you. So the most important risk factors is your neutropenia and the depth of neutropenia. So when we say neutropenia, it's prolonged neutropenia. How much is prolonged, nobody knows, but it's felt that after 10 days is the risk starts, because there are some studies in which at 10 days it was not sure, but at 15 days it was associated. So let's say at least 10 days of prolonged neutropenia is a risk factor. And then it's the depth. That is, if your ANC is less than 100. Prolonged steroid use is already put up to help me out. Again, what do we mean by prolonged steroid use? Somebody will say 1 week, somebody will say 2 weeks, but most of the time it is felt that, okay, 2 weeks of steroids of at least 1 to 2 milligram per kilo per day, or it would be a prolonged steroid. Relapsed leukemia, GVHD, other high-risk cases included. I would add a high-risk leukemia, AML, a person who's had a transplant. I would add this to the relapsed leukemia. Of course, GVHD and prolonged antibiotic therapy would end up being risk factor for fungal infections. That's all.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, though I'm directing questions towards a particular person, the other panelists are free to add their contribution. So if there's anything you want, Ramandeep and Dr. Jatin want to add, please let me know. We'll go to the first case. This is an 8-year-old male, case of AML-M2, favorable cytogenetics, has been planned for induction chemotherapy. So, Ramandeep, my question to you would be, what would be the role of antifungal prophylaxis in this case? And in general, when and what would you use for him or other patients?
Thanks, Suresh. So, as Amita pointed out, this is one of the places where you have prolonged and profound neutropenia, and hence it would be appropriate to give antifungal prophylaxis. The antifungal prophylaxis which you want to use should essentially be effective against the organisms you are targeting or want to prevent, as well as cause least side effects and not cost a lot. In the past, I have personally used fluconazole, recognizing that fluconazole is limited in its antifungal spectrum, particularly against the mold and the aspergillus which we worried about. But because of convenience and cost, it has been a compromise. More recently, I have been using voriconazole for prophylaxis. When to give, we started early in treatment, but essentially you want it to be up and running before the patient becomes neutropenic. And I think, yeah, that answers your questions. Thank you.
So, in general, this is a 2014 recommendation, which showed the use of or the recommendation of prophylaxis was for patients with allo-HCT, pre-engraftment, those with GVHD, autologous transplant, AML, and other prolonged neutropenias. In general, fluconazole was the recommended choice at that time point. And posaconazole was reserved for patients with GVHD or if the incidence of mold infection was high. However, over a period of time, we've seen multiple studies which compared mold active versus fluconazole prophylaxis, either in children or adults. They've shown that mold active prophylaxis had an improved result in terms of decreased fungal infections, decreased invasive aspergillosis, and decreased mortality, but there was no change in the overall mortality. This is a similar adult study. And recently we have this 2020 recommendation as to who needs prophylaxis. Patients of AML, definitely yes. Relapsed disease, definitely yes. There is a weak recommendation for ALL at a newly diagnosed ALL. Allotransplants, pre-engraftment, and subsequently during GVHD, yes. But it is recommended that for those patients with auto-HCT or for other neutropenias, a routine prophylaxis may not be necessary. However, exception may be made for those undergoing tandem transplants or if severe mucositis is expected. And which agents to use? The general consensus is to use a mold-active agent because it has been shown to have reduced in fungal infections, mold and infections, fungal-related mortality, and everything is reduced. But again, there is no impact on overall survival. The same recommendation also says that if the risk of invasive fungal disease is low, fluconazole may also be appropriate. Okay, so going back to a case, Ramandi, this patient on fluconazole was on fluconazole prophylaxis. Now has fever on day 3 following the second cycle of chemotherapy. He is following a second cycle of chemotherapy and has fever on day 3. He's been treated with antibacterials and blood culture has grown candida from the PI. We've been informed from the lab that okay, the PICC and peripheral cultures are showing candida. So Jatin may take this. I mean, what would be the further diagnostic evaluation that you would like to do? The lab has informed that this patient has candida. That's all. What would you like to do?
Thank you very much, sir. So, as the pick line is showing that the candida has grew, so most likely we'd like to subtype also, because based on the further types of candida, we need to target the therapy. And even if not on the first occasion, but yes, after the typing, we know about whether it's a candida paraphyselosis or just a candida albicans tropicalis or it's a candida, krusei, which is usually resistant to the fluconazole. Based on that, we need to target our therapy. And how to do it? We have the conventional methods by the chrome agar, and we have the modern methods like T2 FA, MRSAs, and the Malditoffs and the cultures method. By that method, we can subtype the various types of candida species.
So it's important to subtype it and to find out its antifungal sensitivity.
Absolutely.
Would you recommend that in all cases?
Sir, based on our routine antimicrobial antibiograms, if that most of the infections in our settings is kinda albicans and tropicalis, so we don't need to go for it. We can target by the fluconazole therapy only. But yes, if the patient is not responding and the biomarkers are rising, then we need to shift to the echinocandins and subtyping of the candida species.
Anita, in this case now, this patient has been on fluconazole prophylaxis and has grown whatever Candida species that is there, how would you decide which antifungal to use? Suppose this is Candida albicans or Parasylosis. I mean, would you still like to continue fluconazole, or would you like to change?
No, I think to add on, just as a adding on of what Dr. Jatin has already mentioned, I think we also need to remember that Candida glabrata and Krusei are generally inherently resistant to fluconazole. Now, this child, until we get what it is, the fact that he was on fluconazole and he has grown Candida despite that, I would switch over to simple amphotericin and give it for a minimum period of 14 days, because this is candidemia, and depending on the patient's condition, he has a PICC line, and the PICC line as well as that grew, isn't it? Sorry, the PICC line as well as the culture grew.
Peripheral culture
So,
also grew Candida.
yeah, both of it. And so the PICC line would definitely need to be taken out, and this treatment would be at the minimum 14 days, and then it would depend on how the patient is responding. Because one thing we have to remember is that in antifungals, the duration is sometimes very, in immunocompromised hosts, is most of the time a clinical decision when to stop. You can't have a pinpoint like in blood culture positive, like for bacteria, that you say, okay, 10 days, 14 days, etc. Antifungal, sometimes one may have to give for a prolonged period of time, depending on the patient's situation. But Candida, you will be a minimum of 14 days.
And thank you, Dr. Amita. I would also like to.
Yeah.
I would
Sorry,
also
I
like
was
to
just
add.
saying.
No, sorry, ma'am. I would also like to add one more thing, because the young minds are over here. That the Candida speciation is very important, because sometimes the Candida lusitanii, it is one of the Candida which is resistant to amphotericin B inherently. So we need to know the species. Otherwise, unless we lose the patient, if we don't target species directed therapy. So lusitania is one of the Candida species which is inherently resistant to the amphotericin B.
So the question on removal of the line in this case, since the periphery as well as the central line has shown Candida, would it be mandatory to remove the line? If the line culture had grown and the periphery hadn't, yes, I would agree that we need to do it. But in this case, would you need to remove the line?
The fact that there's Candida in the line, the recommendations of Candida in a line means remove the line. I would remove the line. Even if I know what you're saying, that this is actually candidemia, but the line has it. So I wouldn't like to keep a line in situ.
Okay, just to summarize Candida infection, it could be either superficial or invasive. Invasive could be candidemia, like in our case, or could be involving some organ, like the commonest one which we see is hepatosplenic candidiasis. So this is just an image of hepatosplenic candidiasis. Many times patients may not have any hepatic dysfunction or to guide to this, and one needs to evaluate with imaging to identify such patients. We've already discussed the choice of antibiotics. PICC removal also has been discussed. So we can go on to the next case. Any comments on the previous one? Any additional comments any of the panelists want to make?
I just wanted to add, in principle and in theory, PICC line removal is a recommendation. In practice, as we all know, considering the precious nature of the lines and the cost, we all try to find reasons or excuses to try and delay or defer and even avoid it. So pragmatically, we may not take it out upfront, but I take Dr. Amita's point that it would be advisable and preferable to take out the line.
Okay, so let's go to the next case. 9-year-old female. She has a high risk ALPH positive. She's on induction. So just to say, would you consider antifungal prophylaxis in this patient during induction and subsequently? Ramandeep?
So, when you showed the list of indications for prophylaxis, ALL is one of those which is debatable. ALL relapse, of course you do. ALL high risk, you may or may not do. Again, my personal preference, I have used MRC UKALL 2003 before, and I now use Icicle, where even the intense or high risk ALL protocol doesn't cause prolonged and profound neutropenia in most cases. And so I don't use any antifungal prophylaxis for primary prophylaxis for these patients. I understand that certain protocols may be more intense and certain people may have a preference, and that is reflected in the guidelines that this is debatable and individualized.
Yeah, if I can add, I think to this, one would say that if you are on a protocol or in a particular phase in which the child is going to have an anticipated prolonged neutropenia, then one would give her antifungal prophylaxis. For example, a lot of times in certain blocks, when we know they're going to have a prolonged neutropenia, you may not do it mandatory. You may have a system in which that, yes, when the counts drop below a certain amount, or a certain level, whatever you feel. For example, in our institution, when your ANC is less than 200 or something like that, and in a child of a high risk ALL, at that time we tend to start the child on voriconazole, and as the counts are being monitored, when the counts are recovering, we kind of stop it. It's not that you can give it continuously for a prolonged period of time. That possibly needs to be individualized and thought of, because we have to remember that anytime we're giving any, whether it's antifungal or an antibiotic for prophylaxis, we are contributing to the development of resistant organisms. So you have to be very careful when you're giving this prophylaxis. And I agree with Raman that you may or may not need it, and it would depend on the intensity of the protocol and the duration of anticipated neutropenia. Thank you.
It's not just the question of neutropenia, it is the question of use of prolonged steroids. And that has been one of the factors where in deciding whether to use DEXA in induction or not. I mean, there has been a lot of debate on this, and one of the main reasons has been the occurrence of fungal infections if DEXA is used upfront. So there have been people who say, at least in our country, I mean, that they are seeing more fungal infections in ALL than in AML because of the steroid use. So that was the reason why I actually put this. The recommendation does not say that there is a very robust indication for prophylaxis. Previously, we used to use a lot of prophylaxis, but the interaction with vincristine causing a lot of paralytic ileus, constipation, we've stopped recently. So,
Shailesh, we
Shailesh,
totally,
may I
yeah.
say something on this? I think
sure,
so.
sure. Yeah, sure.
See, I think point which Dr. Ramandeep and Dr. Amita ma'am has made are absolutely correct. But having said that, we have to look at a couple of aspects. One is that what is the incidence of invasive fungal infections in your institution or patient population, and it's kind of quite linked to that also. Number two is, as you said, when we talk of azole prophylaxis, basically for mold prophylaxis with azoles, the interactions are quite huge. So even if you have to use in an induction setting prophylaxis for invasive fungal infections, which is predominantly molds, then you will have to look at an alternative, which may be echinocandin or an amphotericin group rather than azole, which is very difficult to manage during induction with vincristine on board. But whether to use or not, I think the institutional policy based on what their prevalences have been. And I know a lot of institutions where a lot of construction going on, and the risk, their prevalence is quite high, and it may be wise in those settings to use it.
Yeah, thanks, Sunil. Moving on with the case, this case of high-risk ALL, currently not on any antifungal prophylaxis. It's from BFM high-risk blocks. Develops febrile neutropenia without a focus. It started on piperacillin, tazobactam, and amikacin. And blood culture subsequently has shown pseudomonas, which is sensitive to these antibiotics, as well as quinolones, carbapenems, and so on, like a pan-sensitive pseudomonas. Day 7 post chemo, she's still persistently febrile for about 5 days, even after starting antibiotics. She's clinically stable. These are accounts, total count of this 40, platelets 31,000. So, Ramandeep, I would like your opinion. What would you do in this patient? Would you repeat a culture and then decide further management? Or would you change antibiotics, even though you have you're treating with a sensitive organism? Or would you eval or treat for a fungal infection?
So as per just trying to so persistent fever for 5 days after starting antibiotics. So by now, as per the guidelines, you probably would have recultured and maybe even considered switching antibiotics so that you have covered that aspect. Now, if you have done that and you're 5 days and you still have fever, then of course you would want to consider empirical fungal therapy and also do the necessary investigations which you can, whether radiology or anything else, to try and identify it even before the child becomes symptomatic.
So, regarding the evaluation of fungal infection, Jatin, I would like you to comment on what are the tests available and what would be the appropriate protocol of doing it.
Absolutely,
At
sir.
least as far as, yeah.
Yes, sir. So clinically, the patient is on antibiotics for the last 5 days and still not responding. So first step is the clinical evaluation. Second comes the microbiological evaluation. Microbiologically, we go by either by the newer methods, by biomarkers, whether it's a galactomannan or beta-D-glucan. And second is by microbiological in the form of the conventional method, that is the blood culture we need to take to look for find these species. And then third is most important is the radiological also. And by clinical examination, if you are suspecting the chest infection or if you are suspecting the abdominal infection, based on that, we need to evaluate. So clinical, microbiological, and the radiological, all three will constitute our diagnosis.
Okay, so just a brief summary of the approaches. The standard approach would be first to look at the microscopy, then to grow the organism, then to subtype it, and then to find out its susceptibility. Here we're seeing for broadly, we could just divide fungi into yeasts and molds. Yeasts, like in this case, Candida, or in this case with pseudohyphae. Pseudohyphae would indicate invasiveness, so that could be a clue for treatment. Fungi may be septate or non-septate, like in this aseptate fungi, broad fungi with less branching. This is Bucor. And on the right hand side, you can see thin, acutely branching septate fungi, which could be either Aspergillus, Fusarium, or Scutosporium. The simple KOH mount from the tissue sample is likely to give you the diagnosis. Beyond KOH, we now have Calcofluor, which is a fluorescence-based assessment, which can definitely improve the sensitivity of your assessment. And the PAS and Gomori methenamine silver stain on tissue can also help you in diagnosing it. Culture, Aspergillus colony on the left, Candida colony on the right. And we also, however, just a question to Jatin. So far, we've been saying that one should be doing serum galactomannan to monitor patients or in an effort to use preemptive therapy. But the COG guideline 2017 is recommended, consider not using serum galactomannan, considering its high false positive rate. So what's your take on that? And Ramandeep and Amita can also comment whether what is your policy about using galactomannan in clinical practice?
So if you talk about galactomannan false positivity rate or beta-D-glucan false positivity rate, if you talk first of all talk about the galactomannan false positivity rate. Earlier it's been said that the piperacillin-tazobactam therapy, which we give it as an anti-pseudomonal therapy, it can cause false positivity of the galactomannan. But the preservative, which has been earlier used before I think 2012 or 13, it's not been used these days. So piplucin tazobactam false positivity has been substantially been reduced. So it's not been the case which we've seen earlier. And other false positivity like aspergillus, it's not only the one which can cause the uh, positivity in the form of galactomannan, but other fungal infections like histoplasma, even the pseudosporium, the fusarium, that can also cause the positivity in terms of galactomannan. And if we talk about the beta D glucan, yes, if the patient is on dialysis, patient is having the acute kidney injury, patient is on having the wound which has been cleaned with the cotton swabs, that can cause the false positivity in terms of the beta D glucan. So yes, there are false positivity, but yes, I would say that for preemptive therapy, the biomarkers play a major role to start the early antifungal therapy.
Yeah, that
So,
was the general.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to add that, there are guidelines recently for management of invasive aspergillosis in children. And in that, it is very categorically, it says that yes, GM assay has a sensitivity and specificity profile similar to that in adults and is recommended as a screening as well as a diagnostic tool in pediatric patients. So, depending on the situation, you can use it. Some people may use it twice a week or whatever, depending on the clinical situation. And it only has a high false positive in infants. And same, even if you use now, people have even recommended using in a BAL sample. And it has felt that, you extrapolate because adults use it a lot and it would be useful in children as well. And the second, beta glucan, is very non-specific because it's not as for a specific fungus like galactomannan is. So that's why it will pick up a Candida, pneumocystis, fusarium, everything. So the recommendations are the ones which I'm talking about, which is the recommendations for invasive aspergillosis in children. They are against using beta glucan as a screening method. And this is the invasive, what I'm talking about is guidelines for invasive aspergillosis in children as well as neonates. And I think this came out just a few months ago.
Yes, ma'am. You're absolutely right, ma'am.
Yeah.
For invasive candidiasis, we go for the beta D glucan. But beta D glucan, as you already told, that it's a non-specific marker. But if we talk about the galactomannan in preterm infants or premature babies, where the gut is not mature because of the translocation of the bifidobacterium, that can cause the false positivity in the galactomannan test.
So my point was, this is exactly what we were following. It is during the preparation of this presentation that I realized, I was going across this article, that the COG 2017 recommendation has somehow said consider not using serum galactomannan. And just wanted to know what the practice was, and I'm glad to know that okay, we are still on the same board. As far as imaging studies are concerned, just to highlight some of the common imaging findings that you could get in invasive aspergillosis and other fungal infections. So what you have here on the left upper quadrant is the halo sign, which a central nodule with the surroundings slightly area of slightly lower intensity. This is typical of pulmonary aspergillosis. However, such signs are more common in adults, and children it may not be seen. So just because you don't see this sign does not really rule out aspergillosis. On the top right side is a typical feature of pulmonary nodules with some ground glass opacity, and this is one of the common features of pulmonary aspergillosis in children. The right lower quadrant is showing the I don't know whether it is visible clearly because it's in my screen, it's hiding behind the window of the it's showing cavitation in and a crescent sign which happens after treatment and as a response to treatment with antifungals. And the bottom left, you can see a reverse halo sign with hypodensity in between around, and this is typical of mucor. So this patient, high risk ALL, on high risk blocks of BFM, febrile neutropenia, persistent fever, was started on amphotericin, has received it for a few days. A galactomannan was sent, which was 2.1. After receiving amphotericin for about 3 or 4 days, the child developed breathlessness overnight, and previous night the saturation was 97%. In the morning, they were 86 on room air, and we were worried this is COVID. This patient has developed COVID, and the tests, the rapid antigen and the RT-PCR came negative, and we realized that the WBC count was showing an improving trend. So, Amita, what is happening here?
So first thing is, Shailesh, that in this patient, that since he already has a known aspergillosis, my first worry would be depending on the platelets.
There
So
is
I
no,
have
no
to
at this time
stepwise.
point, there is no known aspergillosis. I mean, we have not
No.
evaluated this. This child just has prolonged fever on antibiotics
Okay.
and is now being evaluated for. So this is the status that the galactomannan is 2.1. So this is the only indicator towards aspergillosis in this patient.
So the first thing is, if anybody develops breathlessness and hypoxia and has been known to have neutropenia, I would also first think of not only infections. You have to remember that he could have a pulmonary bleed overnight, because this has happened suddenly if he's bleeding. The second thing is that if a patient has the breathlessness, hypoxia, one has to remember a PCP infection in such a situation, because a PCP infection, the hallmark is that your symptoms are out of proportion to your signs. I don't know the signs in this, but these are the first two things I would keep in mind. Of course, whether I don't know the X-ray or the CT pictures, whether it's a progressive pneumonia or like if it is
we did a CT and this is the picture.
An angioinvasive, yeah, or the X-ray also.
So this is the CT picture.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this goes more in favor of an angioinvasive aspergillosis, from what I can see. Because I would rather have been happier if we had an X-ray also. So that would help.
X-ray was not very informative, so I didn't show it, and it's not very.
Because no, why I'm saying is that sudden breathlessness when you mention, one has to remember
that was not typical of PCP.
Yeah.
In fact, there was just a little silhouting of one of the diaphragms. That's all.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
No,
there was
that's
no
fine.
change. Yeah.
So in this would definitely be aspergillus. We can see plenty of nodules, plenty of ground glassing. So it definitely goes for a pulmonary aspergillosis. And this would, obviously, before we call it definite, we have to have the organism. So at this point for time, one would label it a probable pulmonary aspergillosis.
So would you, in this situation, go ahead and treat, change the for aspergillosis, or would you still like to investigate further? With this, should we go in for some form of?
No, I would treat it as aspergillosis.
Tissue.
Yes, one would try to get tissue, but tissue diagnosis, we have to remember that in this point of time, sometimes doing a BAL is not easy because most children are thrombocytopenic, and a lot of times you need ICU, the respiratory person to do the BAL, etc. Yes, you have to put in efforts to get the diagnosis. At the same time, you start treatment immediately. So what you're seeing on the X-ray is reasonably characteristic of aspergillus in the picture you have just described. However, you have to remember that in the lungs, you can also have other things. For example, the other scary thing is mucus. So that is why one should put in as much effort as possible to get a tissue diagnosis. Otherwise, you start treatment and go along while you're trying to find the organism. And that's why the safest or the easiest at this point still remains amphotericin, despite having other things available. This child, your CT picture is good, and you have a galactomannan, so it does go in favor for pulmonary aspergillosis. And yes, voriconazole would be the simplest and the easiest antifungal to give in such a situation. Anything else you want me to add here, Shailesh?
No, I think you've covered that. In this case, actually, we also suspected a possibility of an immune reconstitution kind of syndrome, because of the sudden drop.
Yeah,
And the
yes, you said your count.
patient actually responded well to steroids. The hypoxia recovered within a few hours. The other thing I just want to say here was that occurrence of fever at the time of neutrophil recovery does point towards the presence of a fungal infection. And I think one should evaluate for fungal infection in this situation. The next question is, when can chemotherapy be resumed for these patients? They will rapidly go back into neutropenia, and there may be a prolonged course of steroids required. So what should the policy be? Amita?
I think that this child, as soon as when your child is stable and well, that it has to be a clinical decision to resume chemotherapy, and you had already said the counts are improving. So one would continue chemotherapy along with your antifungals. And obviously your antifungal again would be for a reasonably prolonged period of time.
So you would also consider secondary prophylaxis in this patient?
In this child, the issue would be that yes, you have it. Your antifungals will continue for a long period, till you treat it, which would be in this situation would end up being anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks, because fungal takes a long time to go. We have to remember that. You're continuing chemotherapy, the fungus is, is going to remain dormant for some time and bounce back whenever it wants, especially once your counts drop. So, which is why they need antifungals for a longer period of time. And once you're giving chemotherapy, your patient is going to become neutropenic. Let's say he is on whichever phase, the consolidation phase, you would probably end up giving him antifungals throughout. So whether it would be a sort of I'm not sure if you would call it prophylaxis or completing the treatment of fungus, for the simple reason nobody knows when an endpoint is reached when you're treating a fungal infection. You could do a scan, but that could also be very, iffy in such a situation.
This is just a follow-up scan on that patient, showing resolution. The child was switched to voriconazole. A week later, this is the finding that the opacities are low. They're showing cavitation, showing signs of improvement. So just to highlight, antifungal treatment strategies having two strategies, empiric and preemptive. Empiric strategy, you treat everybody at risk, moderate to high risk of invasive fungal infections. And preemptive, you only treat in the presence of biomarkers or imaging findings. Both approaches have found equivalent safety, but there is lesser antifungal use in the preemptive group. This is just, I'll just skip this. We'll go to the next case. We just had about 10 minutes and about two cases to cover. This is a 10-year-old male, relapsed ALL, is on salvage induction, receiving vincristine, dexa, L-asparginase, and intrathecal methotrexate. Has fever since one day and has having generalized weakness for the last few days. Performance status is poor. He cannot sit up without support. Has irrelevant talk, is drowsy. There's no headache, vomiting, neck stiffness. There's no neurodeficit. Hemogram shows neutropenia, thrombocytopenia, severe hyponatremia. And in view of the neurological signs, a CT scan was done, which showed a lesion in the cerebellar hemisphere with surrounding edema and mass effect. These are followed by an MRI. These are the MRI images showing lesion in the cerebellum. So, Mandeep, this is a patient who is a case of relapsed ALL, has been receiving steroids for a very long period of time, has a CNS lesion, strong suspicion of a fungal infection. So, how would you proceed in this patient?
Yeah. So what you want to do is you want to narrow your diagnosis and try and identify the reason for this or the organism for this. Because of the location of the lesion, that is easier said than done. And you would have to use both direct and indirect methods to try and establish that. So you would, for example, still do a blood culture. Over here, you would do a serum galactomannan. You may even do a CSF galactomannan, etc. Or or in the end, you might still have to try and get an amount of or a biopsy from that area to be able to identify the reason or the organism over here. If that kind of facility is available and the patient is in a condition where you can do that. Now, that would be in parallel, you would have to start therapy. The location being the CNS would challenge you because the drugs would not penetrate as well as they would be in the blood. IV voriconazole would still be the best drug of choice over here. And along with management of any cerebral edema or any retinal tension, those kind of features.
Okay, so actually initially, and this image was reported to be like a bleed or infarct. So this patient was treated just with antibiotics, CNS decongestive measures, and hyponatremia correction, and did show some improvement with improving counts in the next few days. But review of the scan made us suspect fungus, and we requested a neurosurgeon who initially was very reluctant to touch this patient, considering the neutropenia and the thrombocytopenia. But with the improvement in the counts, we could do a craniotomy and excision of the lesion. The KOH and the histopathology did show aspergillus. Aerobic and anaerobic cultures did not show the growth. Now, in this case, we know this is aspergillus. Dr. Jatin, would there have been a role of doing a fungal culture in this and to find out the species of aspergillus, or sufficient, or whatever we are getting on KOH and histopathology is sufficient for us to make a final treatment decision?
Thank you, Dr. Shailesh. Yes, sir, we need to know the species identification by KOH and by the histopathological examination. We know that it's a septate hyphae, acute angled, and branched. So that are in the favor of the mold, and it could be, aspergillus. We don't know the species so far, for now, and also it could be pseudosporium, it could be fusarium, which can infect the brain, and so we need to know these fungal culture sensitivity result. Also, if we talk about the aspergillus, also in aspergillus, because most of the centers start with the amphotericin B as a primary therapy. So in aspergillus teres, it is again the intrinsically resistant to the amphotericin B. So here amphotericin B will not gonna help. Similarly with the pseudosporium, the amphotericin B will not gonna help. So species identification is must, and that can be done with the passage of time. But yes, at the time when we have the KOH smear or histopathological examination result, we need to start some therapy. At that time, I would like to start with the IV voriconazole, but Dr. Ramandeep has already said.
Okay, regarding CNS penetration of the various antifungals, which of the agents can be used for treatment of CNS aspergillosis? Do all the agents have sufficient CNS penetration to be
So
used?
if we talk about the polyenes and amphotericin B, they have the very less penetration, around 20 to 30% penetration is there. If we talk about the echinocandins, they are very poorly penetrable, should not be used in any CNS lesion. And if we talk about the azoles, in that the vorikonazoles are the one which have the best penetration, less with the posaconazole, and least with the itraconazole. And yes, fluconazole not active against mold, but yes, fluconazole also having the good CNS penetration, but not effective in the CNS aspergillus.
Okay, this patient in future was planned for haploidentical transplant. So, from the antifungal perspective, what management? So, would you recommend voriconazole only, or would you then recommend posaconazole as is commonly used for prophylaxis?
So you're talking about secondary prophylaxis here. Now, obviously,
Right.
you want this patient to recover from this episode before you enter the difficult world of haplotransplant. And as a non-transplanter, I'm going to just use my common sense to answer this question. Because we know that this location would have a relatively poor penetration of posaconazole, I would still prefer to switch this child onto a prophylactic voriconazole, which can be given both in oral and IV forms through the course of the transplant, and watch for any change in the clinical or radiological features suggestive of the lesion coming back.
Would you need to, I mean, obviously, document resolution of the lesion before you take this patient up for transplant? I think that is what would be mandatory also, right?
Right.
The persistent lesion would be a relative contraindication to transplant.
Agreed. I mean, you may not get
Yeah.
complete radiological resolution. As you know, the radiological resolution takes time compared to the clinical resolution. And again, depending on the disease, you may or may not have that much time. But of course, you want to have sufficient clinical and radiological recovery to feel comfortable entering into this.
Okay, so we go to the next case.
Shailesh, before, to add on what Ramandeep said, in the peri-transplant setting, it's very important to have azoles off during conditioning. So azoles are preferably to be stopped 5 to 7 days before conditioning, because they're going to interact with all your conditioning regimens. So this child would need to be on a liposomal amphotericin B, which is AmBisome, during the conditioning phase and few days before that. Once the conditioning is over, then you can switch it over either to IV oral azole preparation. But in the post-transplant period also, you have to be very careful about the drug interactions, which are going to be huge, especially with a calcineurin inhibitor, tacrolimus or cyclosporin. So we need to be careful about that in the post-transplant setting.
Yeah, thanks, Sunil. We go to the last case. This is a ALL precursor B on induction chemotherapy, has developed fever, headache, and a right orbital swelling. Hemoglobin is 6, WBC is 200, platelets 29,000. Amita, how would you like to evaluate this case further? This case obviously has we have already done the blood cultures and other investigations. We started on empiric antibiotics. What else would you like to do?
So this child, any child who has a swelling in the periorbital area, or you suspect anything near the sinuses orbit, the first thing you think of course, since we're discussing fungus, is fungus. So further, the one would get an imaging done urgently. And I would, while we're awaiting imaging, I would definitely add an antifungal. And you can add voriconazole or amphotericin, whatever, at that point of time. Usually at this point of time, I think I would prefer to start amphotericin, because anything which is invasive is either Aspergillus or mucor. So amphotericin is easier, acts against both. We know voriconazole will be useless against mucor. And the other advantage of amphotericin is you can give a very high dose. And in this condition, when one is suspecting some fungus, sometimes it's easier to start amphotericin.
Okay,
we can go on.
Yeah,
sorry.
So we did we started on antibacterials and amphotericin. And a CT scan, unfortunately, I do not have the CT images, but it showed soft tissue opacities in nasal cavity and bilateral maxillary and ethmoidal sinuses. On treatment, the fever persisted. The child developed complete obstruction of the right nostril with a blackish colored substance. This blackish discoloration over the right side of the palate, and scrapings from the necrotic area were suggestive of mucor. So, what would be your further management?
Yeah, so we need to get in the surgeons, and because you got a scraping, so mucor is one of those things that you should get. Anything which is in your sinuses, nostrils, etc. If you can get it out, it's better. So because mucor, there are two pre-morbid conditions in which mucor is relentless. One is a malignancy, and one is in a patient who has diabetes. So in this situation, one would, get the ENT surgeons in and get them to debride the area as much as possible, and of course continue your antifungals in this situation. And you hike up your amphotericin to as much as you can, In liposomal amphotericin, easily 6, and some people even say that when a patient is very sick, you can go up to 10 milligram per kilo with monitoring. So that can easily be done. Of course, he's coming to the next. He's already said that he underwent repeated
Child
surgeries for
has
debridement,
undergone multiple
and
surgeries.
then yes, and then
Child
the poor child
subsequently
had
also developed
laparotomy, colostomy. Yes,
a necrotic
so he got literally disseminated
disseminated.
mucormycosis.
And this
Received
child was continued on
amphotericin,
amphotericin for
and
8
then
weeks. Initially liposomal, but subsequently the conventional form because of cost constraints. Chemotherapy was withheld for about 6 weeks. So this was a very challenging case. And what further advice for chemotherapy and for antifungal management during because unfortunately this case was about 10 years ago. We didn't have any other antifungal at that time other than probably voriconazole, but which is not going to be effective
well,
here.
in all fairness, even still, we are still most of the time. It's not that one
So,
may have a better armamentarium, but the cost is always there.
Giving amphotericin is going to be a problem during even if we have to use in the prophylactic setting. Now, what options do we have? What would you do would you consider giving posaconazole during potential periods of neutropenia?
In this patient, I would. You have a choice. Yes, you have a choice of posaconazole or amphotericin. We have to remember that posaconazole is not the easiest and the cheapest of drugs available. It is reasonably expensive. So, if a patient is lucky enough to have reimbursement, or he is lucky enough to afford it, yes, please go on to posaconazole. But in most situations, we are living in a poor country which has now got poorer thanks to the virus. We would be one would be ending up giving amphotericin, and anytime when you start chemo, anytime the child is going to get an intensive phase of chemotherapy, for at least till he finishes the intensive phase and goes on to the maintenance, one would continue him on amphotericin prophylaxis. You can give it 3 times a week at that point of time, but you would have to continue it until he reaches maintenance. And I mean, for all the youngsters sitting here and the ones in training, we can assure you that this is doable. We have had patients in the past who have had all this happening and now are well off therapy and survivors. So it sounds difficult to give amphotericin. It's not. You have to monitor. One vial of posaconazole does cost about 11 to 12,000, which in a biggish child will not last for long. So we have to remember weigh the cost benefit in such a situation, and according to that you can give your therapy. So that's my take on it. I think Raman and Dr. Jatin.
Jatin, I have a query for you. Okay. Yeah, you want to add something?
Yes, sir. If the patient like this come to me today's scenario, I would like to start with the high dose liposomal amphotericin B, which is the latest recommendation by European Guideline 2019, with the 10 mg per kg. Go for the 1 week, look at the radiological response, and then step down either with the isavuconazole or with the posaconazole, depending upon the availability of the therapy. Drug monitoring of the drug. If the patient has the CNS symptom also, then I would also like to go for the MR venography to look for the cavernous sinus thrombosis, because patients of mucor, they have the tendency to develop the CST, cavernous sinus thrombosis. It is also very important. If that is the case, and we need to consider the neurological intervention also. And then in the step down therapy, apart from the liposomal amphotericin B, we go for the posaconazole or oblique isavuconazole, already been mentioned, and that we keep on continuing it along with the TDM for at least for a duration of around 2 to 3 months.
We seem to be running out of time. Ria, do we have time for some questions for Anna?
So I think 10 minutes should be fine. We started.
Okay, so I'll just make a summary. In this case, there are certain clues on radiology where we can suspect mucormycosis over aspergillosis. One is the reverse halo sign, which I've showed you. presence of significant pleural effusion, more than 10 nodular lung infiltrates. Sinusitis is reported to be more common with mucormycosis than with aspergillosis. 20% of the patients will have disseminated disease, and 50% of those with sinusitis will have intracranial disease. Cornerstone of therapy is antifungal therapy, surgery, and control of the underlying conditions. I think we will end by just asking Dr. Jatin, could we just in brief summarize the antifungal drugs classes and spectrum of action, and also comment on choice of antifungals if a patient has renal dysfunction or is on multiple nephrotoxic drugs or hepatic dysfunction.
So if we talk about we'll take first the azoles. So most of the azoles are active against the Candida species. And if we talk about the prophylactic therapy, we either give the fluconazole for Candida or itraconazole. Both are active. And if we want to go higher, then we can go for the Bori/Posa also. But yes, we need to take it in our mind that the Candida krusei and Candida glabrata. Krusei is almost resistant to the fluconazole, but glabrata to some extent can be in a susceptible dose-dependent manner. In a high dose of fluconazole can respond to the fluconazole, but yes, krusei not responding. Similarly, Candida lusitanii will not going to respond with the amphotericin B, which also we need to take into consideration. If we talk about the mold prophylaxis, we need to add either the voriconazole, and if the patient is not affordable, ITRA, and yes, the best therapy would have been the posaconazole, which has been recommended so far. And also injectable echinocandin that can also be used for the prophylactic in the form of the mold therapy. If you talk about the therapy for the mold, then yes, first line of choice is echinocandins always for the mold, and then depending upon whether the location of the fungus, if the fungus location is in the brain, then the azoles are the first line of choice. In that, Vori will play a major role. Rest of the list is below the voriconazole, and echinocandin will not going to play. Yes, if you are having the fungus like Candida auris in the brain, and we have the Candida meningitis, something like that. So, and that too with the Candida auris, we need to give the high dose casofungin. High dose means we need to be, double the dose as we are recommending in a normal patient. Otherwise, amphotericin B and voriconazole are the best drugs for the CNS penetration. In the urinary tract infection, if you talk about the Vori and the other azoles, all play a good role. Echinocandins again in the urinary tract also don't play any role for the UTI fungal infection. Amphotericin B also depends. If the liposomal amphotericin B, it will not going to work. Conventional amphotericin B will going to work in the fungal infection causing UTI. That's it.
Yeah, regarding renal dysfunction and liver dysfunction, what would be your agents of choice?
Yes, sir. If the patient is having the liver dysfunction, I would like to not to choose the casofungin as well as the amphotericin B also. And azoles also. I would like to go directly to echinocandins like micafungin and anidulafungin. If the both are present in the patient like liver dysfunction as well as the renal dysfunction, my take would be anidulafungin, Eraxis. That is the drug of choice so far. That will cover both the Candida as well as the mold part.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jatin.
Thank you, sir.
I would end my presentation by acknowledging my colleagues, Dr. Sampada Patwardhan, who is the microbiologist, and Dr. Aniruddha Joshi, who has provided me the images as part of this presentation. Thank you very much, and I hand it over back. I'm sorry for the overshooting by about 5-10 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you, Shailesh, for putting all the cases and all the presentation tomorrow together. It really appreciated with your busy time. And on this note, I'll also like to add that your hospital is much in the news because of the PPE which is being used in the hospital. It has been very much appreciated across all the papers and the country. So I think that is hats off to using
Yeah,
eco-friendly
thanks.
PPE. That's very, very, very creditable. Very creditable.
So
For all the people who do not know, Dinanath Mangeshkar Hospital has been using cloth gowns and everything which is not disposable and reusing them, and it has been found to be very effective, which is very important for the simple reason that it's not only adding on to the junk, the plastic which is accumulating, it's also breathable, because any of us who worn that stuff, I have not, but even wearing the mask with the face shield is not easy in our wards these days. So I think the hospital really needs to be appreciated for having this idea, so that it's easy on the doctors as well.
that's really nice.
Thanks.
So I think we'll conclude the session. And first of all, I apologize, I joined a little late for today's session. And first of all, I should thank you, Dr. Shailesh, for moderating and putting all the effort today, not only in presenting the cases, but also getting the fantastic expert faculty on this platform. I also take the opportunity to thank Dr. Jatin, who is a guest today, basically for this audience. And thank you, Dr. Jatin, for your contribution and putting the lab perspectives into the discussions. And of course, our ma'am, Dr. Amita ma'am, who we know has been the teacher of teachers, and she's been a pillar for so many years. And of course, Ramandeep, for your contribution. So thank you very much. We have recorded these sessions, and with your consent, we'll be sharing them with some of the students who may not be able to join, because it's going to be valuable, I think, education material for all of us. So with that, I'm going to close today's meeting, and I thank Ria and Echo for giving the platform and doing the back-end work. Thank you very much again, Dr. Shailesh, for holding this today.
Yeah, thanks Sunil, and thanks Ramandeep, Jatin, and Amita for your expert comments. You really made this session quite lively.
Thank you, Salesh. And
Thank
like
you.
to see you again.
Thank you for the opportunity, sir. Thank you.